It was an unusually warm afternoon in late October when Rachel's life shattered into pieces. The faint breeze carried a hint of autumn, yet the golden leaves falling from the trees outside her window went unnoticed. She sat there, in her wheelchair by the fireplace, gazing blankly at the walls of her living room. The soft crackling of the fire was the only sound breaking the silence that it had been almost a year since her husband, Mark, left. Abandoned was a more accurate word, though she rarely said it out loud. The man she had loved for 10 years, the one who had held her hand through the hardest times, had walked out, leaving her to navigate a world that suddenly felt far too big and too cold for someone bound to a chair. The worst part. She never saw it coming that a year earlier the accident had changed everything. It was supposed to be a short drive to pick up groceries, a routine part of Rachel's week. But in the blink of an eye, her car had collided with a truck at an intersection, and everything went dark. When she awoke in the hospital, groggy from the medication, she couldn't feel her legs. The doctors had tried to sound hopeful, but she knew, even then, that the life she had before was gone. At first, Mark was supportive. He had been there through every surgery, every painful rehabilitation session. His devotion had seemed unwavering. He reassured her, comforted her, and promised they'd get through this together. And for a while, it seemed possible. But as the weeks turned into months, the cracks in their marriage began to show. It wasn't just the physical changes that tested their relationship, it was the emotional distance that began to grow between them. Rachel wasn't the same person she had been, and she could feel Mark pulling away. He tried to hide it, but the small signs were there, the way he avoided eye contact, how he worked late more often, and how he seemed impatient when she struggled to do basic tasks on her own. One night, he came home late, eyes tired, but his posture tense. "I can't do this anymore, Rachel," he said, standing in the doorway as she sat in the kitchen, trying to prepare dinner. She had dropped a knife earlier, unable to pick it up from her chair without help. The sound of the blade hitting the floor had echoed in the empty house for what felt like an eternity. Rachel looked up at him, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" Mark hesitated, but his face was hard. "I just can't do this. I'm not built for this kind of life. I love you, but I need space. I need a life that doesn't revolve around hospitals, wheelchairs, and constant care." The words hit her like a physical blow. For a moment, she didn't speak, her throat tight with emotion. Finally, she whispered, "You're leaving?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I just need some time. Maybe I'll come back when things are better." "Better?" Rachel's voice cracked. "You mean when I'm walking again? What if that never happens?" He didn't answer, and that silence was all the confirmation she needed. That night, Mark packed a bag and left. He didn't say where he was going, only that he needed to figure things out. Rachel sat alone in the quiet of their home, her heart breaking in a way that no physical injury ever could. The loneliness in the months that followed, Rachel's life became a routine of isolation. Friends who once visited faded away, unsure of how to act around her. Her family lived far away, and while they called often, their busy lives made it difficult to visit. She hired a caregiver, Grace, to help with daily tasks, but even with that assistance, Rachel was still alone for long hours each day. The house felt emptier than ever. Every creak, every distant sound echoed in her mind as a reminder of what she had lost, not just her physical mobility but her marriage, her sense of normalcy, her future. She could still vividly remember the sound of Mark's footsteps on the hardwood floors, the way his presence had once filled the space with warmth. Now, it was just her in the wheelchair. Despite everything, Rachel wasn't the type to give up easily. She had always been resilient, a trait that had served her well in the years before the accident. She began to focus on small victories, learning to cook again, finding new hobbies, and eventually starting an online business that allowed her to work from home. But no matter how much progress she made, the loneliness remained. It clung to her like a shadow, a constant reminder of the life she once had. Mark's return one cold evening, just as the first snow of winter began to fall, there was a knock on Rachel's door. It was unexpected. She rarely had visitors, especially not at night. Grace had left hours ago, and Rachel was in her usual spot by the fireplace, a book in her lap. She wheeled herself to the door, her heart pounding as she reached for the handle. When she opened it, there he stood, Mark. He looked different, older somehow, with lines of regret etched into his face. He stood there in the cold, shivering slightly, his eyes filled with a mix of desperation and sorrow. "Rachel," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to talk to you." Rachel stared at him, her emotions swirling inside her like a storm. She hadn't seen him in almost a year. There had been no calls, no messages, no indication that he was even alive. And now, here he was, standing on her doorstep as if no time had passed. "What do you want, Mark?" Her voice was steady, but she could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface that he hesitated, glancing down at his feet before looking back at her. "I made a mistake. I know I hurt you, but I've been living with that regret every day since I left. I thought I could find a way to fix my life, but instead, I ruined everything. I'm lost without you, Rachel." Rachel remained silent, her eyes never leaving his. She had imagined this moment many times over the past year, what she would say, how she would react if Mark ever came back. But now that he was here, she felt numb. Mark took a step closer, his voice pleading. "Please, Rachel. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I need you. I need us." For a long moment, Rachel said nothing. The snow continued to fall around them, and the cold wind whipped through the open door. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "You left me when I needed you most, Mark. You abandoned me when I was at my lowest. And now you think you can just come back and ask for forgiveness? Do you have any idea what I've been through this past year?" Mark's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, dropping to his knees in front of her. "I do know, and I hate myself for it. I was a coward, Rachel. I didn't know how to handle it, so I ran. But I'm here now, and I'll do anything to make it right." Rachel looked down at him, her heart aching with the weight of his words. She could see the remorse in his eyes, the pain that mirrored her own. But could she forgive him? Could she ever truly let go of the hurt and betrayal he had caused? For the first time in months, Rachel felt the tears welling up in her eyes. She had spent so long trying to be strong, to push through the pain, but now, faced with the man who had broken her heart, she couldn't hold it in any longer. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to." Mark's tears fell freely now, and he nodded, his head bowed in shame. "I understand. But I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes. I just want the chance to prove that I can be the man you deserve." Rachel watched him for a moment, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to make him feel the same pain she had felt for so long. But another part of her, a part she had tried to bury, still loved him. Despite everything, she couldn't deny that. "I need time," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to figure out if I can ever trust you again." Mark nodded, still kneeling in the snow. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, waiting." Rachel closed the door softly, leaving Mark outside in the cold. She wheeled herself back to the fireplace, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope that a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Mark returned to visit Rachel often. He didn't push her for forgiveness, instead, he helped in any way he could. He repaired things around the house, ran errands, and even assisted with her business when she needed it. He was trying, really trying, to prove that he had changed. Rachel remained guarded, but slowly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crack. She still wasn't sure if she could fully forgive Mark, but she couldn't deny that his presence brought a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Mark turned to her, his expression serious. "I know I can't erase the past," he said quietly. "But I want to build a future with you. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again." Rachel looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of the decision before her. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the man she had fallen in love with so many years ago. But could she take that leap of faith again? "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly. "But I'm willing to try." Mark smiled, a small, hopeful smile, and for the first time in a long time, Rachel allowed herself to smile back. That it wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't perfect. But it was a new beginning, and sometimes, that's all you need. Chapter 2, Healing Wounds. The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act. Rachel's life had fallen into a rhythm over the past year, one where she was self-sufficient and fiercely independent, though it had come at the cost of her own emotional vulnerability. She had learned how to survive without Mark, but now, with him returning into her life, even in small ways, it was unsettling. She couldn't decide if it was a blessing or a curse to have him back, kneeling figuratively and sometimes literally, trying to atone for his mistakes. Mark's visits were frequent, but not intrusive. He offered help, but Rachel often turned him down. She wasn't ready to depend on him again, afraid of the potential hurt if she opened herself up to him and he left once more. The pain of his abandonment still sat fresh in her mind, like a wound that hadn't fully healed. She couldn't forget how he had left when she needed him most, but then there were the quieter moments, the unexpected ones, where his presence felt comforting. One evening, Rachel was struggling to lift a box of supplies from her office space to her living room. She had been too stubborn to ask Grace, her caregiver, for help earlier that day, and now it seemed like a monumental task. Mark, who had been sitting across the room, silently got up and took the box from her hands without saying a word. He carried it effortlessly to the living room, setting it down next to her. She hadn't thanked him out loud. Her pride wouldn't let her. But the warmth of his quiet assistance stayed with her long after he had left for the night. Mark didn't ask for anything in return. He never pressed for forgiveness or tried to speed up the process of reconciliation. It was like he understood that he had shattered something fragile in her, something that couldn't be mended by simply showing up with apologies and kind gestures. It would take more than that. It would take consistency, time, and the rebuilding of trust, piece by fragile piece. Chapter 3, The Nightmares. Despite the progress they seemed to be making, Rachel's nights were often plagued by nightmares. She would wake up in the early hours of the morning, drenched in sweat, her heart racing, the vivid memories of the accident flashing through her mind. She could still hear the sound of the collision, the shattering of glass, the sharp pain that shot through her body before everything went black. In those moments, the fear and helplessness would overwhelm her, making it hard to breathe. One night, as she sat in her wheelchair by the window, trying to calm herself after another nightmare, she heard a knock on the door. It was past midnight, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She wheeled herself over and opened the door cautiously, only to find Mark standing there, concern etched into his face. "I saw the light on," he said softly. "I was passing by. I thought maybe something was wrong." Rachel hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She could feel the remnants of her nightmare clinging to her, and the last thing she wanted was to appear vulnerable in front of Mark. But something in his eyes, something sincere and gentle, made her step aside, allowing him to enter. He didn't ask questions. He didn't push her to talk about what had happened. Instead, he sat down across from her, his presence quiet and steady. For a long time, they just sat there in silence, the only sound being the distant hum of the night outside. "I have nightmares," Rachel finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the accident. About everything." Mark looked at her, his expression softening. "I can't imagine what that's like," he said. "But if you ever want to talk about it, I'll listen." Rachel nodded, though she wasn't sure she was ready to open up about the darkest parts of her trauma. Still, the offer itself, the knowledge that he was there, meant more to her than she could express. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. Chapter 4, The Unseen Pine. As the months passed, their interactions became more comfortable, almost familiar, but there was still a gulf between them, an unspoken barrier that neither had yet crossed. Mark's guilt weighed heavily on him, and Rachel's hurt still lingered like a scar that refused to fade. But they were learning to coexist in this new, fragile balance. One afternoon, Mark brought over lunch and they ate together in the kitchen, a quiet sense of companionship settling over them. It reminded Rachel of the early years of their marriage, back when everything had felt easy and light. "How's the business going?" Mark asked, gesturing to the laptop sitting on the counter. Rachel had started an online business selling handmade jewelry shortly after the accident. It was something to keep her hands busy, something that made her feel productive and independent. What had started as a hobby had slowly grown into a successful small business, with orders coming in from all over the country. "It's going well," Rachel said, smiling faintly. "Better than I expected, actually. I never thought I'd be able to make a living from it, but here we are." Mark nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "That's amazing, Rachel. You've always been so talented." She felt a warmth in her chest at his words, but it was quickly tempered by the memories of the months after the accident, the months when she had struggled to find any sense of purpose or normalcy. She had clawed her way back to a place of stability, but it had come at a cost. I had to be, Rachel said quietly. I didn't have a choice. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what they both knew but hadn't spoken about. Rachel had learned how to survive without him, and while she had succeeded in many ways, the emotional toll of that journey was something that lingered beneath the surface. Mark's face fell slightly, his guilt evident. I know I wasn't there for you when you needed me, he said softly. And I'm so sorry for that, Rachel. I was selfish. I was scared. Rachel looked at him, her heart conflicted. She wanted to forgive him, to let go of the anger that had been simmering inside her for so long. But forgiveness wasn't something that could be given freely, it had to be earned. I don't know if I can ever forget what you did, Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But I'm trying to move past it. I don't want to hold on to this anger forever. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. I don't expect you to forget. I don't even expect you to fully forgive me. But I hope that one day, we can both find peace. Rachel wasn't sure what peace looked like for them, but in that moment, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal together. Chapter 5, The Invitation. As time went on, Rachel began to feel a cautious sense of optimism about the future. She had rebuilt her life in many ways, but there was still a part of her that longed for closure, for a resolution to the chapter of her life that had been marked by pain and betrayal. One day, while Rachel was working in her office, an unexpected letter arrived. It was from Mark. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding with anticipation. Inside was a simple invitation, a request for her to attend a family gathering at his parents' home. It was an event she had always attended in the past. Before everything fell apart, her first instinct was to refuse. The idea of facing Mark's family, of confronting the memories of the life they once shared, felt overwhelming. But as she sat there, staring at the invitation, something inside her shifted. Maybe this was the next step in her journey toward healing. Maybe it was time to face the past, to confront the wounds that had been festering for so long. With a deep breath, Rachel picked up the phone and dialed Mark's number. I'll come, she said simply when he answered. Mark's voice was filled with surprise and gratitude. Thank you, Rachel. It means a lot to me. Chapter 6, The Reunion. The day of the family gathering arrived, and Rachel found herself sitting in the passenger seat of Mark's car as they drove to his parents' house. It was the first time they had been in a car together since the accident, and the weight of that reality wasn't lost on either of them. Mark was quiet as he drove, glancing over at Rachel every so often as if to gauge her emotions. She appreciated his silence, it gave her time to process the flood of memories and emotions that were swirling inside her. When they arrived at the house, Rachel felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. It had been over a year since she had seen Mark's family, and she wasn't sure how they would react to her presence. But as they stepped out of the car, she was greeted with warmth and kindness. Mark's parents embraced her, and his siblings welcomed her with open arms. Throughout the evening, Rachel found herself engaging in conversations, laughing at old stories, and for the first time in a long time, feeling a sense of belonging. Mark stayed by her side, attentive but not overbearing. He seemed to understand that this was a significant moment for her, and he didn't push her beyond her comfort zone. As the evening drew to a close, Rachel found herself sitting on the back porch, looking out at the stars. Mark joined her, sitting quietly beside her. I'm glad you came, he said softly. Rachel nodded, her gaze still fixed on the night sky. So am I. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace settling over her. It wasn't a complete resolution, and there were still wounds that needed to heal, but in that moment, she allowed herself to believe that they could find their way back to each other. Chapter 7, The Future. The months that followed were filled with small steps toward healing. Mark continued to show up, not just physically but emotionally as well. He became a partner in Rachel's life once more, helping with her business, supporting her through difficult days, and standing by her side as they navigated their new normal. Rachel, in turn, allowed herself to be vulnerable again. She shared more of her feelings, opened up about the nightmares that still haunted her, and slowly began to let go of the anger that had once consumed her. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments where Rachel questioned whether they could truly move past the hurt and betrayal. But each time, Mark was there, patient and understanding, willing to do whatever it took to rebuild their relationship. One evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Mark turned to Rachel, his expression serious. I love you, he said quietly. I never stopped loving you, even when I was too scared to show it. I know I hurt you, and I know I can't erase the past. But I want to build a future with you. I want us to be partners again, in every sense of the word. Rachel looked at him, her heart full of emotion. She had waited so long to hear those words, and now that they had finally been spoken, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. I love you too, she said softly. But love alone isn't enough. We have to keep working at this, Mark. We have to keep choosing each other, every day. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with determination. I will. I promise. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel believed him. Epilogue. The journey forward. As Rachel and Mark continued their journey toward healing, they learned that forgiveness wasn't a single act, it was a process. It required time, patience, and the willingness to face the difficult truths that had once torn them apart. But through it all, they remained committed to each other, to the love they had once shared and the new foundation they were building together. In the end, their story wasn't one of perfect reconciliation or a fairy tale ending. It was a story of two people who had been broken by life's hardships, but who had chosen to fight for their relationship, to rebuild what had been lost, and to find strength in their shared journey, and sometimes, that was enough. Chapter 8, the unraveling. The calm that had settled between them was fragile, and both Rachel and Mark knew it. Though they had made strides toward mending their relationship, the scars of the past still lingered beneath the surface. Some nights, Rachel would wake up to the haunting memories of the accident, and though she no longer felt entirely alone, the fear of abandonment remained. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily restored. Mark had taken up residence in a small apartment nearby, understanding that Rachel wasn't ready to have him move back in. It was a mutual decision, giving them both the space they needed to heal. But with that space came distance, both emotional and physical. As much as Rachel wanted to believe that they were on the right path, there were moments when the doubts crept back in, moments when she questioned whether their reconciliation was truly possible or if they were simply delaying the inevitable point. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, Rachel found herself sitting on the balcony, gazing out at the city lights. The cool evening air brushed against her skin, and she wrapped a blanket tighter around her shoulders, seeking comfort in its warmth. Mark had texted earlier, asking if he could stop by. Rachel had told him she was tired, not in the mood for company. It wasn't entirely a lie, she was exhausted, but it wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the emotional toll of carrying the weight of their broken relationship. She wanted to believe they were moving forward, but every step felt like a struggle, and there were days when it felt easier to push him away than to invite him back. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was a message from Grace, her caregiver. Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Haven't heard from you in a few days. Let me know if you need anything. Rachel stared at the screen for a moment before typing a quick response. Thanks, Grace. I'm okay, just a little tired. I'll see you tomorrow. She set the phone down, leaning back in her chair. Despite the progress she had made over the past year, there were still moments when the loneliness crept back in, reminding her of all that had been lost. It wasn't just about the accident, it was about the life she had envisioned, the future she had once planned with Mark. That future felt uncertain now, like a dream she could no longer reach. Chapter 9, the confrontation. The next day, Mark showed up at her doorstep, unannounced. Rachel wasn't surprised. He had a habit of appearing when she least expected it, as if he could sense when she was struggling. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression a mix of concern and hesitation. Can I come in? He asked, his voice tentative. Rachel hesitated for a moment before nodding and wheeling herself back from the door to let him in. She could tell he had something on his mind, something that had been weighing on him for a while. They sat in the living room, the tension between them palpable. Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor. I've been thinking a lot, he began, his voice low. About us. About everything that happened. Rachel didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of where this conversation was heading. I know I hurt you, Mark said, his voice shaking slightly. And I know I've said I'm sorry, but I don't think I've ever fully explained why I left. I think I owe you that much. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She had waited so long to hear his explanation, to understand what had driven him to abandon her in her darkest hour. But now that the moment had arrived, she wasn't sure she was ready for the truth. Mark took a deep breath before continuing. After the accident, I was terrified. Not just for you, but for us, for what our lives would look like moving forward. I knew everything was going to change, and I didn't know if I could handle it. I didn't know if I was strong enough to be the man you needed me to be." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I was selfish, Rachel. I was scared of losing my freedom, of being tied down to a life I wasn't prepared for. So I ran. I thought I could escape it all, that I could find some version of happiness on my own. But all I found was emptiness." Rachel sat in silence, her emotions swirling inside her. She had always known that Mark's departure was rooted in fear, but hearing him admit it out loud, hearing him confess to his weaknesses, was a different kind of pain. "I've spent the past year trying to figure out how to live with that regret," Mark continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. But I need you to know that I'm sorry, not just for leaving, but for not being the man you deserved." Rachel's throat tightened as she fought back the tears. She wanted to be angry, to lash out at him for the pain he had caused. But all she felt was sadness, a deep, aching sadness that they had both been broken by circumstances beyond their control. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "You left me when I needed you most. You broke my trust. And I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I understand. And I'll accept whatever decision you make. I just needed you to know the truth." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy in the air. For the first time in months, Rachel felt a sense of clarity, a recognition that their relationship, as it had once existed, was over. They could never go back to the way things were, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward. Chapter 10, The Decision. In the days that followed, Rachel found herself reflecting on Mark's confession. It had been the first time he had truly opened up to her, the first time he had allowed himself to be vulnerable. She had always known that his fear of commitment and responsibility had played a role in his decision to leave, but hearing him admit it had given her a new perspective. But even with that understanding, Rachel wasn't sure if she could trust him again. Trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild, and despite Mark's efforts to prove that he had changed, the scars of the past still lingered. One evening, as Rachel sat alone in her living room, she received a call from Grace. It was a brief conversation, Grace asking if Rachel needed anything, Rachel assuring her that she was fine, but as soon as the call ended, Rachel found herself feeling overwhelmed by the loneliness that had been creeping in over the past few days. She thought about Mark, about the way he had shown up for her recently, about the way he had tried to make amends. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. The next day, Rachel called Mark and asked him to come over. When he arrived, they sat together in the living room, the tension between them palpable once again. "I've been thinking a lot," Rachel began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "About us. About everything that happened." Mark listened quietly, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to continue. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "But I also don't want to hold on to this anger forever. I don't want to live my life consumed by bitterness and resentment." Mark nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand." Rachel took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm willing to try, Mark. I'm willing to give us another chance. But this time, things have to be different. We have to be honest with each other. We have to communicate. And most importantly, we have to rebuild the trust that was broken." Mark's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes, Rachel. I promise." Chapter 11, The Path to Forgiveness. Rebuilding their relationship wasn't easy. It required patience, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront the pain that had once torn them apart. There were moments when Rachel wanted to give up, moments when the weight of their shared history felt too heavy to bear. But each time, Mark was there, steady and unwavering, reminding her that they were in this together. They began attending therapy together, working through the unresolved issues that had plagued their marriage for years. It wasn't just about the accident or Mark's departure, it was about the underlying fears and insecurities that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. In therapy, Rachel learned to express her feelings more openly, to communicate her needs without fear of rejection. And Mark learned to listen, to really listen, not just to the words she spoke, but to the emotions behind them. It was a slow process, but over time, they began to rebuild the trust that had once been shattered. Chapter 12, The Strength and Vulnerability. As the months passed, Rachel began to notice a shift in their relationship. The walls that had once stood between them were slowly coming down, replaced by a new sense of intimacy and understanding. They still had their struggles, there were still moments of doubt and fear, but they faced those challenges together, as a team. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Rachel turned to Mark and spoke the words that had been lingering in her heart for months. "I forgive you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "Not because you deserve it, but because I need to let go of this pain. I need to move forward." Mark's eyes filled with tears as he reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Thank you," he whispered. "I promise I won't let you down." Chapter 13, A New Beginning. With forgiveness came a sense of peace, a peace that Rachel hadn't felt in a long time. She had spent so much of the past year living in the shadow of her pain, but now, with Mark by her side, she felt a sense of hope for the future. They continued to work on their relationship, each day taking small steps toward healing. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real. And for Rachel, that was enough. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, watching the world go by, Rachel turned to Mark and smiled, a genuine smile, one that wasn't weighed down by the past. "I'm glad you came back," she said softly. Mark smiled back, his eyes filled with warmth. "So am I." And in that moment, Rachel knew that they would be okay. They had faced their darkest moments and come out the other side, stronger and more connected than ever before. Their journey wasn't over, but they were ready to face whatever came next, together. Epilogue. The journey continues. As the seasons changed and the world around them shifted, Rachel and Mark continued to build their life together. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but they faced them with a newfound sense of strength and resilience. They had learned that love wasn't just about the good times, it was about the hard times, too. It was about showing up, even when things were difficult. It was about forgiveness, vulnerability, and the willingness to grow together. And as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set on another day, Rachel felt a sense of contentment wash over her. She had been through hell and back, but she had come out the other side stronger than ever before, and with Mark by her side, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Because sometimes, love wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. It was about choosing each other, day after day, no matter what, and that was enough. Chapter 14, New Horizons. Rachel had forgiven Mark, but forgiveness wasn't a magic wand. Though they were healing, new challenges lay ahead as they tried to navigate their new dynamic. As months passed, Rachel's business began to take off in ways she hadn't anticipated. Orders were pouring in, and what had started as a modest endeavor became a thriving online shop. With this growth, however, came new responsibilities that stretched Rachel's time and energy. Mark, too, had gone back to his career as an architect. The demands of his job, combined with his desire to support Rachel's business, left him juggling multiple priorities. They began to fall into a familiar pattern: long hours spent apart, exhausted evenings with little conversation. Rachel noticed the subtle shifts, but at first, she dismissed them, convinced that they could handle anything now that they had faced their past. But one evening, while Rachel was packing up orders late into the night, she felt the weight of the imbalance. She was still sitting in her office at 11 p.m., while Mark was at an event with his colleagues. She knew it wasn't his fault, he had told her about the work commitment weeks ago, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being left behind once again. When Mark came home, she was still in her office, hands sore from hours of work. He walked in quietly, his tie loosened, clearly exhausted from the long day. "Hey," he said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "You're still working?" Rachel looked up from her desk, a tired smile on her face. "Yeah. Orders have really picked up lately." Mark walked over and gently massaged her shoulders, sensing her weariness. "You've been doing great with the business. I'm so proud of you." His words were kind, but something inside Rachel stirred. She pulled away slightly, turning her chair to face him. "Mark, I know you're proud, but I can't help feeling like we're falling into the same patterns again. You're gone so much, and I'm left handling everything on my own." Mark's brow furrowed, and he sat down across from her. "I thought we were doing better. I've been trying to balance everything, work, you, the business." Rachel sighed, her hands rubbing her temples. "I know you're trying, but I'm tired, Mark. I'm tired of feeling like I'm always the one holding things together." He reached for her hand, but she pulled back. "We can talk about this. We can figure it out. Can we? She asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Or are we just repeating old mistakes? Chapter 15. The breaking point. Tensions mounted over the next few weeks as both Rachel and Mark found themselves drifting apart once again. Though they had worked so hard to repair the damage from the past, they were both realizing that reconciliation wasn't the end of the road, it was just the beginning. Healing was an ongoing process, and the stresses of their individual careers and personal growth were creating new cracks in the foundation they were trying to rebuild. One weekend, Rachel had planned a small getaway, a few days at a cabin upstate to relax and reconnect. It was something they both needed desperately. She had already packed their bags and made arrangements with Grace to take care of the business while they were gone, but on the day of the trip, Mark called. "Rachel, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice strained over the phone. "I can't make it today. We've got an emergency project at work, and I'm going to have to stay late to handle it." Rachel sat in stunned silence, the disappointment settling in like a heavy weight. This was supposed to be their time, a chance to reset after the emotional distance that had crept back between them. And now, he was canceling. "You promised, Mark," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "We've been planning this for weeks." I know," Mark replied, clearly torn. "But I can't just leave. It's a major project, and the deadlines are insane. I'll make it up to you, I swear." Rachel hung up the phone without another word. She wheeled herself back into the living room, staring at the packed bags by the door. The cabin trip was supposed to be their chance to fix things, to reconnect and address the growing distance between them. But now, the silence in the house felt heavier than ever. That night, she sat alone by the fire, a glass of wine in her hand, watching the flames dance in the hearth. For the first time in months, doubt began to creep back into her mind. Was it worth it? Could they really keep this up, or were they simply delaying the inevitable? Chapter 16. Unspoken resentment. In the weeks following the cancelled trip, Rachel and Mark barely spoke. Their once open communication had been replaced by brief conversations, each filled with unspoken tension. Rachel threw herself into her business, which continued to grow, and Mark was consumed by his work. They lived parallel lives, connected by proximity but emotionally distant. It was Grace who finally spoke up, sensing the strain in Rachel's demeanor. She had been helping Rachel with her business for months now, and over time, they had formed a close friendship. Grace wasn't just an employee, she had become someone Rachel trusted with her deepest fears and doubts. "You don't seem like yourself lately," Grace said one afternoon as they packed up orders together. "Everything okay with you and Mark?" Rachel hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But the words came tumbling out before she could stop them. "We're not okay, Grace. We're drifting apart again. And I'm scared." Grace listened intently, her expression filled with concern. "Have you told him how you feel?" Rachel shook her head. "Not really. I mean, I've tried, but I don't think he gets it. He's so wrapped up in his job, and I'm over here, handling everything else. It's like we're in two different worlds." Grace placed a hand on Rachel's arm, offering a reassuring smile. "You've been through so much together, Rachel. You can get through this too, but you need to talk to him. Really talk to him." Rachel nodded, though the thought of another confrontation made her stomach twist. She had spent so much energy trying to rebuild their relationship, and the idea that it could all fall apart again terrified her. Chapter 17. A painful truth. That evening, Rachel sat in her office, her thoughts swirling as she considered Grace's words. She knew she needed to confront Mark, to have an honest conversation about where they stood. But part of her feared the answer. What if they couldn't make it work? What if this was the end? Mark came home late again, as usual, his tie loosened and his face weary from the day. He found Rachel in the living room, staring into the fire, her face unreadable. "Rachel," he said, his voice hesitant as he walked over to her. She didn't respond immediately, her thoughts still tangled. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Mark's expression shifted, concern creasing his brow. He sat down across from her, sensing the gravity of her tone. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Rachel began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "About us, about everything we've been through. And I'm starting to wonder if, maybe we're trying to force something that just isn't meant to be." Mark's eyes widened, his face pale. "What are you saying?" Rachel took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. I'm saying that I don't know if we can keep going like this. We're both so focused on our own lives, and we've lost sight of each other. I thought we could rebuild what we had, but maybe some things are too broken to fix. Mark shook his head, his voice rising with urgency. No, Rachel, we can fix this. We've come too far to give up now. I know I've been distant, and I know I've let work take over, but I'm willing to make changes. I'll do whatever it takes. Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she looked at him, her heart aching. I don't want you to make promises you can't keep, Mark. I don't want to go through this again, feeling like I'm not a priority, feeling like I'm always the one left behind. Mark reached for her hand, his grip firm and desperate. You are a priority. I've been trying to balance everything, but I know I've been failing. Please, Rachel. Don't give up on us. Chapter 18, A Crossroads. The conversation left them both emotionally drained, but it was a necessary turning point. For the first time, Rachel had voiced her deepest fears, and Mark had been forced to confront the reality of their situation. They were at a crossroads, and the decisions they made in the coming weeks would determine the future of their relationship. Mark made a conscious effort to be more present. He scaled back his hours at work, even taking time off to help Rachel with her business. They spent more time together, rekindling the connection that had once been the foundation of their marriage. But the lingering doubts remained, like shadows that refused to disappear. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Rachel decided to bring up the subject that had been on her mind for some time. I've been thinking about our future, she began slowly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames in the fireplace. About what it would mean to really move forward. Mark looked at her, sensing the seriousness of her tone. I have too, he said quietly. I know we've made progress, but I also know there's still a lot of work to be done. Rachel nodded, grateful for his honesty. I think we need to be realistic about what we want, and what we need from each other. We can't just pretend that things will magically go back to the way they were before. We've both changed, and so has our relationship. Mark's face tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. So, what are you saying? Do you want to keep trying, or do you think it's time to let go? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unsettling. It was a question Rachel had been avoiding for months, but now that it was out in the open, she felt a strange sense of relief. They couldn't keep living in limbo, pretending that everything would be fine if they just worked a little harder. They needed clarity, even if it meant facing the possibility that their marriage might not survive. I don't know, Rachel admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Part of me wants to keep trying, because I still care about you. But another part of me wonders if we're just delaying the inevitable. What if we're not meant to be together anymore? Mark's jaw clenched, and he ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with her words. I don't want to believe that, he said softly. I still love you, Rachel. And I believe we can make this work if we both want it. I still love you too, Rachel replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But love isn't enough. We need trust. We need to feel like we're in this together, not just trying to survive day by day. Mark leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Then let's build that trust again. Let's take it one step at a time. I'm not giving up on us, Rachel. I refuse to. Rachel's heart ached at his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could somehow rebuild what had been broken. But she also knew that their relationship would never be the same, and maybe that was okay. Maybe they didn't need to go back to the past, but instead, forge something new. I'm willing to try, Rachel said, her voice steady but full of emotion. But we need to be honest with each other, every step of the way. No more pretending. No more hiding. Mark nodded, reaching across the table to take her hand. Agreed. We'll face this together. For the first time in months, Rachel felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wouldn't be easy, but they were finally on the same page. They had reached a crossroads, and for now, they had chosen the path forward, together. Chapter 19, The Quiet Before the Storm. As weeks passed, Rachel and Mark continued to rebuild their fragile relationship. Mark's effort to cut back on work and be more present in their marriage was appreciated, but the deeper emotional wounds were not so easily healed. There were good days, days when Rachel felt optimistic about their future, and then there were days when old fears resurfaced, threatening to undo the progress they had made. Rachel's business was flourishing, growing faster than she had anticipated. Orders came pouring in, and the success was both thrilling and exhausting. She had always dreamed of being self-sufficient, but now that her business was taking off, she found herself overwhelmed by the responsibilities that came with it. Grace was a huge help, but even with her support, Rachel was working late into the night, struggling to keep up with demand. Mark tried to help where he could, but his job remained demanding, even with the scaled-back hours. They were still trying to find a balance between their professional lives and their relationship, but it often felt like they were juggling too many things at once. One evening, after a long day of work, Rachel sat in her office, surrounded by boxes of orders that needed to be shipped out. Her hands were sore from hours of packaging, and her eyes burned from staring at the screen for too long. She heard Mark come home, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, but she didn't move from her desk. "Hey," he said softly as he entered the room. "You've been at this all day. You need a break." Rachel sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I can't stop now. I've got deadlines to meet." Mark walked over and placed his hands gently on her shoulders, massaging the tension that had built up over the course of the day. "I know you're busy, but you're going to burn yourself out if you keep going like this." Rachel's shoulders tensed under his touch, and she pulled away slightly. "I'm fine, Mark. I've got this under control." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, and the pressure of running her business was taking its toll. She didn't want to admit it, not to herself and certainly not to Mark, but she was struggling to keep everything together. Mark sensed her frustration and stepped back, giving her space. "Okay," he said quietly. "But if you need help, I'm here." Rachel nodded, though she didn't look at him. "Thanks." As Mark left the room, Rachel stared down at the pile of orders in front of her, feeling a sense of dread wash over her. She had worked so hard to build something for herself, something that gave her independence and purpose, but now it felt like the very thing she had fought for was consuming her. Chapter 20, an unexpected turn. A few weeks later, as Rachel was preparing for a large product launch, she received an unexpected email. It was from a major online retailer who had noticed her growing presence and wanted to feature her jewelry on their platform. It was the kind of opportunity that could take her business to the next level, but it also came with a daunting level of responsibility. Rachel stared at the email, her heart racing. This could be the big break she had been waiting for, but it would also mean scaling her business in ways she hadn't anticipated. She would need to hire more staff, invest in larger production facilities, and possibly even bring on a business partner. That night, she told Mark about the offer over dinner. "That's amazing, Rachel," Mark said, genuinely excited for her. "You've worked so hard for this. You should go for it." Rachel hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. "I don't know if I'm ready for something this big. It's a huge commitment, and I don't want to take on more than I can handle." Mark reached across the table, taking her hand. "You're more than capable of handling this. You've already built a successful business on your own. If anyone can make this work, it's you." Rachel smiled, appreciating his support, but the weight of the decision still hung heavy on her shoulders. "It's just a lot to think about. If I say yes, I'm going to need to hire more people, and I don't even know where to start with that." "Then we'll figure it out together," Mark said confidently. "You don't have to do this alone." But that was the problem. Rachel didn't want to rely on anyone else, not even Mark. She had spent so long building her independence, learning to stand on her own after the accident, that the idea of needing help felt like a step backward. "I'll think about it," she said finally, though her mind was already racing with the possibilities, and the fears, that came with this new opportunity. Chapter 21, a growing distance. As the days passed, Rachel found herself consumed by the decision of whether or not to accept the retailer's offer. She had meetings with consultants, spoke with other small business owners, and weighed the pros and cons, but the more she thought about it, the more conflicted she became. Meanwhile, Mark noticed the growing distance between them. Though he had tried to be supportive, he could sense that Rachel was pulling away, retreating into her work as a way to avoid confronting the deeper issues between them. They had made progress in rebuilding their relationship, but now it felt like they were back to where they started, two people living separate lives under the same roof. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Mark finally broke the silence. "Rachel, we need to talk." Rachel looked up from her laptop, her eyes tired from hours of work. "About what?" About us, Mark said, his voice steady but filled with concern. I feel like we're drifting apart again. And I don't want to lose you. Rachel sighed, closing her laptop and rubbing her temples. I'm just overwhelmed right now, Mark. This business opportunity is huge, and I don't want to mess it up. I get that, Mark said gently. But you don't have to handle everything on your own. I'm here to help, if you'll let me. Rachel stared at him, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She wanted to let him in, to share the burden of her worries, but she didn't know how. She had spent so long being independent, proving to herself that she could survive without him, that the idea of relying on him again felt foreign. I don't know if I can, Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's expression softened, and he reached for her hand. Rachel, you don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to do everything on your own. I'm your partner, we're supposed to face these challenges together. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. She knew he was right, but the fear of being vulnerable again, of letting someone in only to be hurt, was overwhelming. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm scared of getting hurt again. I'm scared that if I let you in, you'll leave me, just like before. Mark's heart broke at her words, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. I'm not going anywhere, Rachel. I promise you, I'm here for the long haul. But we can't make this work if you don't let me in. Rachel buried her face in his chest, the tears spilling over as she allowed herself to be vulnerable with him once again. It was a moment of reckoning, a turning point in their relationship where they both realized that moving forward would require more than just effort. It would require trust, openness, and the willingness to face their fears together. Chapter 22, A Leap of Faith. The next morning, Rachel woke up with a sense of clarity that she hadn't felt in months. She had spent so much time trying to protect herself from the possibility of failure, both in her business and in her marriage, that she had forgotten what it meant to take a leap of faith. She sat down at her desk and drafted an email to the retailer, accepting their offer. It was a decision that scared her, but also one that excited her. She wasn't just taking a chance on her business, she was taking a chance on herself. Later that day, she found Mark in the kitchen, making coffee. I accepted the offer, Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Mark turned to her, a smile spreading across his face. That's amazing, Rachel. I'm so proud of you. Rachel smiled back, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path, not just in her career, but in her life. I'm going to need your help, she admitted, her voice soft but resolute. Mark walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her. You've got it, he said simply. We'll figure it out together. Chapter 23, Building a New Future. With Mark's support, Rachel began the process of expanding her business. It wasn't easy, there were countless challenges along the way, from hiring new staff to managing production, but for the first time, Rachel felt like she wasn't facing those challenges alone. Mark was there every step of the way, helping her navigate the complexities of growing a business while also rebuilding their marriage. Their relationship wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension and doubt. But they had learned how to communicate, how to be honest with each other about their fears and insecurities. And most importantly, they had learned how to trust each other again. As the months passed, Rachel's business continued to grow, and so did their bond. They faced each obstacle together, as partners, and with each challenge they overcame, their relationship grew stronger. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Rachel turned to Mark and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. I'm glad we didn't give up, she said softly. Mark smiled back, his eyes filled with warmth. So am I. In that moment, Rachel realized that they had finally found their way back to each other. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but they had chosen to fight for their love. They had chosen to rebuild, to grow, and to face the future together, stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. Epilogue, a journey of love and growth. Rachel and Mark's journey wasn't defined by a single moment or event. It was a series of choices, of decisions to stay, to fight, to forgive, and to trust again. It was a journey of love and growth, one that had tested them both in ways they hadn't expected but had ultimately brought them closer together. As they looked toward the future, they knew there would still be challenges, both in their personal lives and in their relationship. But they also knew that they had the strength and resilience to face those challenges together, because love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about choosing each other, over and over again, even when things were hard. It was about building something real, something lasting, something that could withstand the storms of life, and for Rachel and Mark, that was more than enough.